Ground warfare is about defending or capturing land. The terrain itself plays a central role. Both in attack and defense, commanders must use the landscape to their advantage, an age-old principle that has proven true across the centuries. The Romans, whose territory spanned a wide variety of landscapes and terrains, were masters of engineering the battlefield. (122 AD). On what is today the border between England and Scotland, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a wall to defend his empire's northern frontier. A construction with the hallmarks of Roman engineering. It took advantage of the landscape and followed a natural rocky outcrop. It was 73 miles long and reinforced with fortresses. It was a massive building project with a clear military objective.
If you have a long frontier and you don't have adequate number of people who can be deployed, then you build a wall, and that keeps the enemy out and can be guarded at much less cost.
Just like the Great Wall of China, which was begun 700 years earlier, Hadrian's Wall was both a physical barrier and a psychological one, a demarcation of territory for all to see. It was an impressive, permanent reminder that the empire would be defended. But the Romans also used engineering for offense. They were experts at using pick and shovel to gain advantage over even their most fortified enemies.
If you have a wall, there's only 3 ways to get past it. You go over it, you go under it, or you go through it. And there's a science that will develop to do that.
The Roman method of attacking defensive walls was most famously seen at Masada in Israel. The capture of this mountain fortress in 73 AD reveals how Roman engineers used manual labor, ingenuity, and careful planning to clinch victory. The Jewish rebels defending Masada had carefully chosen the site because of its inaccessible location.
Masada is an excellent example of an ancient fortification. In other words, taking a naturally very strong natural feature, this enormous mountain really behind me, and then fortifying it.
With its sheer walls and high summit, Masada gave the rebels a defendable garrison with 360-degree views of their enemy. But Roman engineers found weaknesses in the rebels' position and devised a plan to defeat them. They began by building 8 fortified camps surrounding the mountain. Each was a base from which siege operations could be launched. Here, facing the southern end of Masada, one camp was deliberately built at the top of a cliff.
This is actually the only place that you can see what's going on top of Masada.
It performed important surveillance for the camps below. These camps were all part of a wider offensive undertaking that included a 3-mile-long encircling wall. It was called the circumvallation. The wall measured almost 6 feet wide and 10 feet high. Its purpose was clear.
It stops anybody going in, stops anybody going out, and to all the defenders on the top, it is a stone noose has been put round them and there is no escape.
It was sort of a statement. We surrounded you, you're doomed.
The massive encircling effort could intimidate the rebels, but it couldn't defeat them. For that, the Romans came up with something far more difficult to engineer.
The only way that the Romans could really get to grips with the defenders at Masada was by constructing an enormous assault ramp.
The first step in the process was to choose a suitable location. The Romans identified the one chink in Masada's armor, a natural spur of land on the western side of the fortress. That could become the foundation for the ramp. But even with a spur to build on, the construction job presented unique challenges. The ramp's gradient had to be shallow enough for soldiers to drag a huge armored siege tower to the top of the peak. Once the tower was in place, the Romans would use a powerful battering ram housed inside to smash through the fortress walls. Throughout the building process, Roman artillery raked the tops of the walls with stone shot to protect the construction crews. But the biggest problem was how to engineer a 200-yard-long ramp with the stability to support the heavy siege tower. Physical clues from the site give us some idea how they did it.
Now, these bits of timber here have been here for nearly 2,000 years. They were laid by Roman legionaries when they were building this immense ramp behind us. We think there's some form of reinforcing, rather like we have steel rods in concrete today to hold that together. So these timbers were driven in on horizontal layers to try and keep the ramp in one compact mass.
Though the ramp has never been fully excavated, experts believe that the Romans dug terraces into the sides of the natural spur to make a stable foundation. With a secure base, they then built up the ramp itself with prefabricated wooden boxes filled with rubble and reinforced with timber. The result? A consistent gradient strong enough to bear the weight of the siege tower. Masada fell to the Romans because the ramp neutralized its height advantage and also exploited a flaw in the design of the fortifications.
The towers at Masada do not project out beyond the wall line. This does not allow for any flanking fire. It reduces their defensive capability quite substantially. So what we have at Masada is essentially a passive defensive system.
Defenses that could not withstand the Romans' carefully planned attack. From 50 BC to 150 AD, the Romans' systematic siege operations, supported by innovative engineering and the budding science of artillery, played an important role in the empire's expansion. It would be many centuries before defenses evolved to counter such versatile assaults. The Middle East, in the year 1188. Saladin, the great Muslim leader, had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. But to take control of the Holy Lands, Saladin still needed to drive the Crusaders from their castles, like this one, Crac de Chevalier in today's Syria. The castles allowed the Crusaders to maintain a foothold in the region.
One thing that we have to remember is the number of the Crusaders in the greater Syria region was minuscule, and they were holding much larger land that they could defend.
Like Hadrian's Wall had for the Romans, castles like Crac compensated for this lack of manpower. Their design had evolved during the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries.
We have 150 years of struggle between the two sides, attack and counterattack, and they are learning from each other.
This frontline experience gave battle engineers the opportunity to experiment with their castle fortifications. The result was a new kind of defensive construction, far superior to the passive system at Masada.
What happened in the second half of the 12th century and the first half of the 13th century is that these castles became much more massive. The whole structure tended to become taller, bigger, broader.
Every design feature at Crac had a specific purpose based on a concept called defense in depth. The first line of defense relied on towers that were strong enough to house heavy trebuchets on their tops. These massive counterweight artillery pieces could strike an attacking force more than 350 yards away. The towers deliberately projected outwards, enabling lines of fire to both the front and flanks. Unlike at Masada, every approach was covered. But these outer defenses were only the first layer of protection. Within them, engineers had constructed additional obstacles, a series of concentric walls.
Concentric walls on a castle mean an outer defense and an inner defense. And you can, in fact, have an outer, a middle, and an inner. You can take this thing quite a long way. It gives you defense in depth.
Defense in depth also relied on defense in height.
One of the vital features of concentric design is that your inner fortifications, your inner line of wall, has to be higher than your outer, so that if the enemy does take the outer wall, they cannot use it as a fortification for themselves. They are completely overlooked by archers and defenders on the inner wall.
But even if both the walls were breached, the castles had fallback lines of defense. At Crack, the entrance to the castle was engineered to provide defenders with a series of killing zones. With the aid of a paintball gun, David Nicole can reveal how they worked. The man in the helmet plays the part of the attacking soldier who has broken into the castle. He will be Nicole's target. As he advances up the passageway, the intruder will be open to attack through openings known as murder holes.
It's directly above the main entrance passageway, which runs beneath us from the main gate to the interior of the castle. Right. If the defenders fail to get the attacker during the first opportunity to shoot, they'll have plenty of others. If I haven't stopped them then, I have one last chance.
The murder holes are a clear example of the castle's approach to defense. Multiple defensive positions. And they prove themselves in battle. In 1188, the Crusaders at Crack successfully beat back Saladin's attacks. From then on, defense in depth would remain an important part of military engineering and strategy. In the fast-moving battles of modern war, there is often no time to build fortifications. But the defensive principles of the Crusader castles still apply. Iraq in 2004, the fight for Fallujah. U.S. Marines came under heavy fire from Iraqi insurgents.
Get out of room.
Both sides improvised as the battle developed.
What's gonna happen? M16s, 240. We're gonna pop up. We're gonna do 5 seconds of suppression. Ready, set, go, hose up.
In a constantly shifting battlefield, walled rooftops offer both defensive protection and a height advantage for these soldiers. From up here, they can shoot down on the insurgents' positions. But Fallujah's buildings give advantage to both sides.
Every single street is effectively its own fortress dominated by its own miniature castles of rubble or whatever. So from a command and control point of view, it makes it incredibly difficult.
Command and control is key to success in battle. And the course of military history has shown that it can be affected by many factors. Terrain is one. The impact of innovations in weaponry is another. In the 14th century, the advent of gunpowder artillery completely transformed the way battles were fought. Military engineers had to adapt to this powerful new threat. 1480, southeastern Europe, the island of Rhodes in what is today Greece. An army of Ottoman Turks bombarded the fortress of Rhodes with the most powerful gunpowder artillery the world had ever seen. Medieval walls were not designed to withstand such fierce attacks. A small force of Christian Hospitaller Knights held firm against the Muslim onslaught. After a brutal siege that lasted 2 months, the Ottomans withdrew. The Hospitallers prevailed, but only just. And their leader, Pierre d'Aubusson, knew the Ottomans would be back. D'Aubusson was an early witness to what heavy artillery could do to medieval stone walls. He realized that Rhodes' defenses needed an upgrade.
Pretty much the next morning, Pierre d'Aubusson gets up and says, "Whoops, we didn't win because our walls were invulnerable. And so he starts to rebuild them. They rethink the whole principles of fortification. No longer do they feel that tall, thin walls will be effective against gunpowder weapons.
Walls were widened from 8 feet thick to 26. And a new defensive feature, called a bastion, appeared. A bastion is a massive fortification that projects out from the main wall. It enables more lines of fire against oncoming attackers. Several bastions were built on roads, each one like a giant gun turret bristling with cannons.
The guns had become so big and so powerful, 18, 20 tons, 12, 14 feet, that the Hospitallers had to build their own firing platforms, these enormous platforms, just to counter the recoil of them.
The bastions and gun platforms were just two of the many new defenses built by the Hospitallers.
It's kind of odd to walk around the walls of roads and you don't see anything that is the same as another feature. It's almost as if they're experimenting with everything that anybody thinks of that might preserve the city from the guns of the Ottoman Turks.
This curious construction is called a caponier.
It's a thin gun gallery that sticks out right at the sharpest angle of the walls. This could be filled with smaller guns and could be fired down both sides of the moat to cover any attacks made on it or on the walls next to it.
And this freestanding wall, called an outwork, was created by d'Aubusson when he widened the moat. It provided an additional layer of defense.
Instead of just digging 50 meters of moat, he leaves this outerwork in the middle of the moat. Now the attackers have to go down one side of the moat, defeat the outerwork, go down the other side of the moat, and now they get to attack the walls.
In June of 1522, the Ottomans returned. Tens of thousands of soldiers, led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, laid siege to the fortress. Facing them, a Hospitaller force of barely 6,000.
I don't think that anything like the 1522 siege had been seen in warfare ever before.
Wave after wave of Ottoman assaults broke upon the newly strengthened walls of Rhodes.
The Knights Hospitaller would kill 1,000, and they'd look up, and there'd still be 20,000 because another 1,000 had arrived from Turkey. There's one eyewitness, Jacques de Bourbon, and he talks about the blood being so thick on the ground from so many Ottomans being killed that you can't see actual dirt. It's just blood.
Though the Ottomans lost thousands trying to crack Rhodes' new defenses, their attacks kept coming. After 6 months of siege, the Hospitallers' own losses finally forced them to surrender.
In the end, Suleiman the Magnificent, the one who wins, this young sultan, admits to the Hospitallers that he had lost 103,000 men to take Rhodes, and that he'd gladly lose 103,000 more.
Despite the Hospitallers' eventual defeat, the strength of Rhodes' innovative defenses had caught the attention of the world.
Pretty soon, all throughout Europe and all throughout the Middle East, people are building forts just like the Hospitallers had built in Rhodes.
Rhodes was part of an explosion of ideas about how to combat gunpowder artillery. In Italy, engineers built star-shaped fortresses with triangular bastions designed to provide defensive crossfire. And they experimented with earth as a complement to masonry walls. One section of this simple brick wall has been backed with earth, more than tripling its width. The remainder has no reinforcement. Each side will be shot at from point-blank range with this reproduction cannon. After several shots, the unreinforced wall section is close to collapse.
Bleeding through.
Next, the cannon will be trained on the earth-backed section of the wall. The results are quite different.
It's amazing the difference between the stone here, where there's no earth behind it, and here where addition of earth has acted as a shock absorber. Here we have no penetration whatsoever. The wall is solid.
In the 16th century, similar experiments would have pointed the way to wide brick walls with thick earthen backings. Defensive engineering would soon reach a new level of sophistication. 1698, Eastern France. Construction was underway on a fortress that would represent the zenith of defensive design, Neuf-Brissac. Today, Neuf-Brissac is a quiet little town, close to the border with Germany. Its defenses were designed by brilliant French military engineer Sébastien Vauban. Vauban was a nobleman, schooled in the art of fortification.
Everybody learned the rudiments of fortification. They learned it because the nobility was still the warrior class, and fighting in this time had to do with knowing the techniques of fortification.
Vauban's talents, though, set him apart. His rise came at a time when France was at war with virtually every European state on its borders. Vauban built or upgraded some 160 fortresses. At the core of his defensive design was the Italian Star Fort. But Neuf-Brissac shows how Vauban shaped the landscape around the fort to add to the advantage.
Right now, I'm walking just outside Neuf-Brissac. What's really amazing about it is that from where you are right now, you can't even see all the ditches. There's countryside all around, but it just looks like we're walking on a slightly hilly terrain, when in fact, we're only 20 meters away from all the fortification ditches.
They're designed to be hidden from view, with cleverly created high ground for the defenders.
The ground is gently sloping upwards. It was calculated very carefully by Vauban so that the height advantage would still belong to the people inside the fortifications. Suddenly, here you are, and you have the counterscarp, you have the ditch, you have this vast protection of the fort. At the time, all you would have seen from this point of view was earth and the barrels of guns and cannons pointed at you from soldiers positioned on the ramparts.
To threaten the main fortress walls, an attack first had to get past these outworks. What were experiments at Rhodes nearly 200 years earlier had now become standard fortification features. The bastions also had guns inside, which defended the ground immediately in front of the main wall.
What that means is that one bastion covers the other one. They each shoot crisscross style so that there's no cover along the wall.
From inside a bastion, one can see the well-designed lines of sight and fire. Any attackers who made it to the ditch would be caught in a deadly crossfire. Though Neuf-Brissac was never tested in battle, many fortresses built on Vauban's model were. And not only in France. Fort McHenry, at the mouth of Baltimore Harbor. In 1814, the American garrison successfully withstood a massive British naval bombardment. The battle inspired the Star-Spangled Banner.
Fort McHenry is very much indebted to the Vauban style and the French influence. In fact, Fort McHenry was built by 3 different French military engineers.
McHenry, like Neuf-Brissac, is a star-shaped fort with bastions at each point, low earth-backed walls, and outworks.
During the British bombardment, they fired over 1,800 heavy 13-inch, 200-pound exploding shells at Fort McHenry. So you can imagine those bombs raining down and exploding over the fort. But the design of the fort and its thick, heavy walls helped shelter the men.
Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, the garrison held out. Eventually, the Americans drove off the British ships. McHenry's successful defense was a testament to Vauban's design. But Vauban's expertise was not just with defense. Like the Romans, he turned to engineering for offense as well. These 17th century documents lay out the techniques many of them attributed to Vauban for conducting a siege. Digging was vital. They suggest a series of zigzagging and parallel trenches, which attackers could navigate to bring artillery close to the enemy's walls. Just like his Roman predecessors, Vauban understood how battlefield engineering could provide command and control in almost any situation. But in the centuries that followed, military engineers would once again have to evolve as more powerful weapons brought new challenges and opportunities to the battlefield. July 1864, the American Civil War. Petersburg, Virginia, an important supply center for the Confederates and a gateway to the state capital of Richmond. The town was under siege. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had built a 10-mile-long defensive line to protect it. Facing him were the forces of Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Both sides were dug in.
The increased lethality of the battlefield because of rifled weapons caused first soldiers and then later their generals to alter the ground at every opportunity. Dig that field fortification, get your people underground so that the attacker had to come at you from a position of disadvantage.
High stone walls had disappeared, replaced by fortified earthworks that went down, not up. As the attacker, Grant wanted to avoid a long, drawn-out siege. His creative plan came from one of his officers, Henry Pleasants, a former mining engineer.
He was indicative of a new kind of soldier that really represented the popularization of scientific and technical knowledge, and were able to apply that during the war.
Pleasants proposed a secret engineering operation. He would dig a tunnel under the Confederate line and blow it up from below.
Pleasants needed to make sure that the end of the tunnel was in exactly the right place. If it had been too far in front of or behind the Confederate lines, the effect of the explosion would have been minimal.
Like modern surveyors, he used a tool called a theodolite to measure the angles between various points on the battlefield. This enabled him to calculate the exact length and direction of the tunnel. He determined that it needed to be more than 510 feet long. At that distance, ventilation at the tunnel face would be a critical problem.
As the miners continued to work, as they breathed out their carbon dioxide without air coming in to the tunnel, they would have quickly suffocated. Pleasant's solution was quite magnificent in its elegance and simplicity.
First, carbon dioxide would be removed by sinking a shaft into the tunnel near its entrance. At the bottom, a continuously burning fire would draw the stale air up and out. To avoid drawing attention to the smoke, Pleasants would have his men burn decoy fires along their lines. Meanwhile, the stale air moving out at the entrance would draw fresh air to the tunnel face through a wooden duct.
Here's our construction of the ductwork that the air went into where the soldiers were working.
This modified aquarium can reveal how Pleasant's system worked.
This Pyrex tube represents the ductwork that they built. The Union lines would be over here, Confederate lines to the left, and this Pyrex tube represents the vertical shaft that Pleasants constructed.
The burner acts as the fire at the entrance to the tunnel. Ross first fills the mock tunnel with smoke to represent the stale air. Once the burner is lit, the stale, smoky air is warmed and rises up and out of the chimney shaft. The moving flaps at the tunnel face show that fresh air is being drawn in, keeping the Union soldiers alive. After 34 days of digging, the secret tunnel was finally complete. Union troops stood ready to attack as the final preparations were made at the face.
At the end of it, in kind of a T shape, they had two 30-foot galleries where they would store 4 tons of black gunpowder.
This huge quantity of gunpowder was placed directly beneath the Confederate line. Early in the morning of July 30th, 1864, the fuse was lit.
There was this tremendous explosion, almost like a geyser going off.
Body parts, wagon wheels, cannons, huge pieces of dirt the size of a house began to rain down. The Confederate lines that had stood seconds before were now obliterated. and what was left was an enormous crater.
More than 200 Confederates were killed in the explosion. But a poorly directed follow-up assault put the Union troops into rather than around the crater. What became known as the Battle of the Cauldron resulted in almost 4,000 Union casualties. Although the action was unsuccessful, the massive crater and Henry Pleasant's tunnel remain, a reminder of the engineer's ability to transform the battlefield. Barely 50 years later, this kind of underground operation would reach remarkable new depths. Spring 1916, World War I. The Verdun battlefield in France. German and French armies were locked in a bitter struggle. Both sides dug tunnels under the strategically important hill of Vauquois. Simon Pepper, a military architecture historian, has come to explore. He enters through one of the tunnels on the French side. Underground, there is still part of a railway that was used to transport excavated earth from the tunnel face.
Below the hill of Vauquois, there is an absolute mass of tangled network of tunnels, each one trying to get under the enemy's tunnels so that they could destroy them or break into them and kill the miners.
This map shows the French tunnel network on the south side of the hill, the German tunnels on the north, and the village of Vauquois in between. In total, more than 10 miles of tunnels were dug. On the French side, soldiers left the tunnels at the end of each day. But for the Germans, there was no respite.
Their men lived in the tunnels for weeks at a time, lodging in little dugout chambers off the main galleries.
Signs of the Germans' presence are everywhere. Here, carved into the wall, is the symbol of an iron cross.
All warfare is horrible, but the underground war of mining and countermining must be amongst the most horrible in most people's imagination, where you're operating in the dark, in foul conditions, running with water, trying to work quietly so that you weren't overheard by the enemy, is at risk either of being blown to eternity or suddenly find your workings invaded by fighters armed with clubs and knives for a grim fight in the dark.
This underground warfare was made even more deadly by the arrival of a new weapon.
The big difference by the time we get to the First World War is that high explosive has become available.
The high explosives of World War I had 10 times the destructive force of gunpowder. At Vauquois, they were used in more than 500 separate explosions. The top of the hill was literally blown away. The French eventually prevailed, but all that remained of the village was a few brick foundations. Underground warfare continued sporadically into the 20th century, especially during the Cold War conflicts in Asia. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong built the incredible Cu Chi tunnel system, which included 155 miles of tunnels. They served as bomb shelters, arms stores, transit routes, and a launch pad for surprise attacks against American forces. But the use of underground engineering peaked in World War I, when the Western Front was defined by the deadly trenches that dominated the battlefields. And making them more effective was a new kind of above-ground barrier: barbed wire. This late 19th century American farming invention quickly made its way onto the fields of war. It shaped the direction of a battle by hindering movement or funneling attackers into deadly killing zones. And because barbed wire is mostly empty space, it's difficult to destroy.
You walk up to the barbed wire, and there's no way to get past, and there's really no way back either. And the enemy machine guns, which are trained on you, are going to cut you down.
At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British artillery tried to cut through the German barbed wire before their infantry attacked. They used air-bursting shrapnel shells to try and tear the wire apart, but it was tougher than anticipated.
This represents a shrapnel shell, in as much as shrapnel shells were used to attack barbed wire entanglements.
Steel balls backed by an explosive charge will mimic the air burst of the shrapnel shell.
If you were to be bold enough to lie there, I can guarantee you're going to be seriously dead. But you're not a barbed wire entanglement, and the mechanics of it are very different.
The shell explodes 3 feet above the wire.
Well, as we can see, the wire is intact. There are 6 strands, and there were 6 strands before we fired it.
The steel balls have penetrated the wood, but done nothing to the barbed wire. The same thing happened at the Somme, and the British paid a heavy price.
On the northern sectors of the battlefield, perhaps about 2/3 of the battlefield, the barbed wire was not cut. Barbed wire was perhaps the most crucial element in predicting the outcome of a battle.
Barbed wire's invulnerability helped establish it as a vital defensive tool in World War I. And it has played an important role in many conflicts since. Its modern incarnation, razor wire, is still a common feature on today's battlefields. But there was still another new defensive innovation in World War I. For the defense of some strategically important towns in France, a new kind of fortress was created. One such structure was Fort Douaumont, which helped defend the town of Verdun. It was a pivotal spot on the French line and an important crossing point on the Meuse River. Douaumont's design was a response to the increased power and range of artillery.
Most of these fortifications are underground, and the tops of them are protected by earth to absorb the shock and the concussion of artillery blasts.
But earth was not the only layer of protection at Douaumont. The original fortress had been built in the 1870s. Just 30 years later, the French realized it was outdated.
We're on the south face of Fort Douaumont, and what we can see here is very clear evidence of the upgrade that took place shortly before the First World War. The light-coloured stone is the original design for the fort. The grey material, the concrete here, is the massive thickening that took place in response to the added power of artillery.
Douaumont was part of a radical rethinking of what a fortress should do.
The fortress system at Verdun is not one fort, and it's not one gigantic set of walls that connect one another. What it is instead is a system of large forts and smaller forts, what the French called ouvrages, that are designed to protect one another and cover one another.
A network of 19 forts defended Verdun. This system, which acted on a large scale, like the bastions of a Vauban star fort, provided overlapping zones of defense. A fort like Douaumont could neutralize an attack on its neighbors by laying down a wall of defensive artillery fire.
The big gun here, the 150mm, was capable of firing some miles and would defend the neighbouring forts by sweeping the ground in front of them, and sometimes even sweeping the tops of them.
Douaumont would receive reciprocal support from the adjacent forts.
The loss of a fort did not necessarily mean that the entire system collapsed. You could still fight from the other forts.
Like the concentric walls of the Crusader castle, this was an effective use of defense in depth, just updated for the challenges of modern warfare. Verdun's fortress system was soon tested in a momentous battle. At first, the Germans seemed to be winning. They attacked in February 1916, and by early March, Douaumont had been captured. In June, Fort Vaux fell as well. But the other French forts didn't follow.
While 2 of the major forts fall, Douaumont is the largest of the forts by far. The system itself holds, and as a result, the Germans don't get into Verdun and they can't cross the Meuse River in force.
Douaumont was recaptured by French forces in October, and they eventually won the Battle of Verdun. The success had a lasting effect, influencing French generals after the war as they tried to fortify France against future attacks.
After the war, the idea was to extend these fortifications along the border to protect the country against a new kind of attack.
The French needed a physical barrier, because their soldiers were scarce. Their population had not recovered from the losses of World War I.
The French in the 1930s had a major manpower problem. They could not compete with Germany in terms of mobilizable manpower of military age.
Their solution was the Maginot Line.
France's Maginot Line blazes into action.
It had similarities to Verdun's overlapping fortresses.
The theory behind the Maginot Line is to take some of those same principles, underground fortifications, interlocking systems, systems that mutually reinforce one another, to create a defensive line that would help France in a future war.
French military planners believed that entrenched fortifications were their best hope for achieving command and control. Today, hidden in the hills of eastern France, some of the Maginot Line still remains. Armored gun emplacements, tank traps, and man traps, all part of the Hackenberg Fortress. It's a series of linked combat blocks. Here at Block 5, each opening would have been occupied by an artillery piece. Much of what is exposed today was hidden back in the 1930s. Camouflaged observation turrets were just one distinctive feature of Hackenberg.
By the standards of the time, the Maginot Line was really incredibly sophisticated.
They were using all the technologies that could be used at that time. I mean, revolving turrets with a high rate of fire.
One of the electrically powered gun turrets has been restored. It housed cannons that would rise up, shoot several shots, then disappear from view. Underground, Hackenberg's expanse is revealed. More than 6 miles of tunnels, served by their very own train. Built to be self-sufficient, even if they lost electricity, the combat blocks could be powered by underground diesel engines. Every part of the Maginot Line was designed for defense.
The defensive is supreme, i.e. it's far better to sit in your defenses and smash the enemy to pieces as he attacks you, rather than move out of those defenses and be the people who are doing the dying.
But by the time World War II arrived, warfare had moved on. German generals knew they could not attack the Maginot Line head-on, so instead, they exploited its one weakness. They went around it.
And it's hardly surprising that when they launched their major attack against France in 1940, that they would not do so in northeastern France, which was very well defended, but rather through Belgium, which was a lot more weakly defended.
The Maginot Line did its job. The Germans did not attack it in 1940. They went around it because they respected the power of the Maginot Line.
But respect meant little in the face of Germany's fierce and innovative attack. The Nazis relied on speed and mobility to make the Maginot Line obsolete. They called it blitzkrieg, rapid, coordinated armored thrusts supported by heavy air cover. The Germans tore through Belgium and into the vulnerable flank of the French defense. But despite its success, the Germans later fell victim to the very same limitations of static defense. They built the Atlantic Wall, huge concrete defenses along the coast of Western Europe. But on D-Day, in 1944, the more mobile Allies overcame them.
When you try to rely upon static defenses to defend great long frontiers, really, you're never going to achieve the densities of strength that you need to stop an enemy anywhere. The enemy's always got the initiative. He can decide where to attack, in what strength to attack, to what purpose to attack.
Since World War II, success in warfare has increasingly depended on mobility, on a commander's capacity to rapidly adapt and sometimes change the battlefield environment. And so, in the global conflicts of the 21st century, the skills of the military engineer are as important as ever. Needing command and control, generals still rely on them to forge offensive or defensive advantage. At Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, soldiers erect temporary fortifications, preparing the ground for the arrival of new troops. And just as Roman legionaries shaped the landscape at Masada 2,000 years ago, so do modern soldiers still use pick and shovel to mold the terrain.